Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode and we will discuss on energy. Energy is a very important aspect for Bangladesh, India and Pakistan because now energy has a very big challenge. So hopefully from today's discussions we can get some specific guideline, a better strategy. And that World Talent Economic Forum we are developing policy for developing nations. So through this kind of dialogue we can get a really better strategy for our country. First I would like to give chance Professor David Smith.
Well, Sharif, I agree with you. This is a very important topic all around the world, and particularly as we look at the drivers that are pushing this one forward, because we're seeing the transition away from petroleum-based energy and going to all other different types of energy, from very green energy with solar power, wind power, to thermal power, to wave motion power, and many others. Uh, and one of the problems with that is that uh, many of those tend to be cyclically powered. So there needs to be a solution for storage of that energy that's generated and be able to bring it back into the network when those sources are not generating at their potential and others. And this type of energy, long duration energy storage, is an everyday element of grid planning and energy network management today. And it's driven by factors other than just storage. It's technology advances, it's the business elements of it, it's the fact that it's there. And you see one in the United States, the type of long duration energy storage, it would actually surprise you, because in the United States, about 95% of the operational storage of energy is in pumped hydro. And what that is water that's been saved up that is run through turbines to generate energy when it's needed and on demand. And that's about 95%. But you see it really going up, and you see the elements with things like Li batteries being used now, even at homes, to begin to store energy from solar panels, to store it from small windmills and other point of use energy generation. And there's a lot of work trying to go right now in some of the long duration energy storage to see what is the business cases where there's a return on investment. Many places where they have tried it, for example, one of the large scale tests a couple of years ago is they took one of the large salt domes that are formed underground in areas next to oceans, and they tried to turn one of those into a battery, a big battery. And it worked marginally well as an example there. But you just see so many different ones today. Like I said, you see the hydropower, you see thermal type of storage, where you heat something up and it generates heat back, or a cooling material. You see liquid air is when you see compressed air, you see flow batteries, you see all different types. I had the privilege of a few years ago of leading a roadmap for the US military that was titled uh, High Density Energy Storage. Because the problem with some of the storage things we've talked about before is they're fairly low density. Even things like Li batteries, iron batteries, mercury batteries, and others are pretty low density storage today. But they're the best of what we have as we look at this domain. And there's a need to really look beyond that, into a higher density type of storage. Uh, Within the military, our goal in looking at this was 2,000 watt hours of storage per kilogram. And that was a target that we could not achieve in our roadmap in the next 15 years. And the technologies just aren't there yet, and the density isn't there yet. But as you look at this large duration uh, type of storage, it really has to go there, and it particularly has to be there as we transition more and more to wind and solar type of sources to generate our power, because they only produce at certain times. And it's the current technologies are very expensive too, particularly when you look at the Li batteries and how they're going to go. And here's the real interesting thing for Sharif, for your listeners and things, is that today there's not a clear winner. There's just so many different techniques out there, and there's so many innovations that we're seeing happening every month in some of the high density power storage and the long duration power storage, that there's a lot of opportunity to really move that way and to move further. And we're also seeing a real big uptake of thermal. And thermal can generate easily at multiple times, but thermal also comes with the ability that you want to be able to store the excess that's not going to the grid and not just waste it. And the same with some of the other technologies too. So that's kind of a quick introduction to this, and be more than happy to come back with a little bit more.
Thank you. Mr. David Schumacher.
Yeah, great introduction there, David Smith. Appreciate it. All this hinges on the future is electric. Electric demand is great now, and it's going to continue to be even greater in the future. With just take a look at what the demand for electric-powered vehicles and stuff is going to put on the grid, and it's going to change the grid charging patterns. I mean, typically a grid would be looking at heavy power usage during the day and into the early evening, and then not so much overnight. But with charging of vehicles and other things that need to be recharged during that period of time, that dynamic changes. Now, why storage? Well, electricity is produced, used, and if there's any excess, it's essentially wasted, or you try to shift it into another area, into another power grid, into something neighboring, or into some of the storage systems that we currently have, but as David Smith so eloquently said, they don't work all that well for right now. So we have some beginning ideas as far as what to do with that. But the driver here, I think, is the future is electric. And from the transhumanist perspective, the future takes a lot of power, and a lot of that power is going to be electric, even if, like right now, petrochemicals produce a lot of electricity. And the energy stored within the petrochemicals and can be released whenever we need it. We need that same kind of dynamic when we're working with just the clean energy sources. And has already been pointed out, my solar panels on my roof only provide me power when the sun shines. And today, we're having thunderstorms here in the Phoenix, Arizona area. And when I go online, I can look at my power maps and see what I generate from day to day. And I know today is going to be a low production day. So having some type of storage is great, but that technology isn't so good. I didn't buy batteries for my storage system because it just wasn't economically feasible at the time. There's been some changes. It's having me look at that again. So I participate in a power sharing system where I sell excess power back to the grid. The grid manages that with its neighbors, and then I pull power that I need overnight when my roof panels are resting up for the next day, sitting up there on the roof. So I'm giving you a kind of a personal account, but that plays out all across the board as far as energy, especially electric production and distribution is concerned. I'm going to keep my opening remarks short, as we've had a couple of illustrious people come on, and I'm interested to hear what they have to say. But when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about public policy and how it affects other areas, such as what's going on in the military in this area. But for right now, I'll pass the baton.
Mr. Donald.
Well, my colleagues have covered some of the very important points. I kind of frame it in a simple terms is that solar and wind don't work unless the wind's blowing or the sun is out. And we have to have some sort of way, as David was pointing out, that we'll be able to provide power when that isn't happening. And so we need a way to fill in the gap. And right now, lithium ion batteries, or batteries in general, they don't usually work long enough to be able to fill the gap. I mean, they're not considered to be um, long-term storage. They're they're not, and we need to find ways to fill that gap. Um, they're not considered right. They're not considered long-duration storage. So I've read a fascinating report by McKinsey and another. So anyway, it's being addressed by industry, and the way it's being. They just recently started a long duration energy storage council, which has a number of members, and it's being it's being worked on from the highest levels. And the state of California has put a lot of incentives into it, and I think others have pointed out that long duration energy storage is not one thing. There's several different varieties of it. There's the way that the Long Duration Energy Storage Council um, sorts it out is that they say there's thermal, which is in ways that heat allows energy generation. So heat, for an instance, can make steam, and it's a little complicated. I won't go into that in detail, but then there's mechanical. I mean, right now I could. And then there's mechanical, which is like compressed air. There's electrochemical. They can do things. One of the things that you can do is you've heard of hydrogen cars and so on like that, but you can take an energy. You can separate hydrogen and water, take the hydrogen, use the hydrogen, and just kind of do that in a loop, and get the energy that way. And then there's purely chemical ways of doing it. So there's many ways, and within each of those categories, there's many ways of doing it. So there's dozens or even hundreds of ways people right now are working on doing long duration energy storage. And what I'm going to finish with right now is that it's the amount of money that people are making from it is doubling every year. And it's expected by 2040, it'll provide 1.5 to 2.5 terawatt hours. And the entire US energy consumption is about 4 terawatt hours. So that means that the long duration energy storage will be capable of filling those holes that we're talking about easily. And what right now it's expensive, it's new, and people are trying a lot of different technologies to find out how they could make it cheapest. So California especially is giving tax incentives for people to make it worthwhile to try it, and even grants and things like that. So and many countries are doing that as well. So it's a place that if you want to kind of get ahead of the curve, long duration energy storage is something that's being developed right now, and is probably going to be the key, kind of part of the backbone of the grid in maybe 15 years.
Excellent. Mr. Raymond.
Good evening, Sharif, gentlemen. Happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Once again, very much the layperson in this area, but I'm very happy to pass along my impressions. I did hear earlier this year that there are large lithium deposits in Dubai that have yet to be uncovered or utilized. And seeing the growth of this city over the last 20 years, I'm pretty sure that they're also working on long-term storage energy sources. Probably they'll be wanting to make use of the resources that they've got there as well. So I wonder if lithium, although it doesn't seem to have the lasting qualities that we're looking for, um, I see there's probably new technologies that will be developed around helping to extend the life of that. Um, um, I heard another interesting concept that from a colleague who was saying that the technology is already in existence to be able to utilize the metal that are in the roads by coating them with attraction or like solar panel type devices, so that the vehicles can actually draw on the energy as they're passing over the surfaces that they're moving on, like highways. So this for like urban movement and transportation is quite an interesting thought, to be able to utilize what is there and sort of fractionalize it, if you like, and spread it over a larger area to be able to utilize what is available. It doesn't really relate to long-term storage energy devices, though. That'll do for my opening remarks, though. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor David Smith, yes, now energy has a lot of issues, lot of challenges. What type of alternative sources we have, and it can solve the problem?
Well, Sharif, your timing is always so very good in looking at those, because there's many that we see right now that could work and play here very well. Just 1 second. Let me do this. I am going to upload a quick slide, and it's going to provide, I think, part of the answers that you're talking about. And it should be there in a second. Or is it? Well, so let me answer while I'm trying to do this. There's just so many different techniques there and how they can be used. The batteries, like we've talked about, looking at things like the fuel storage. And like I said earlier, if you look in the United States, 95% is actually using pumped hydro, which is one of the other forms that you can use in there. Some of the other approaches, let me see if I can show it now. Can you bring that up for me, Sharif?
Yes.
This is a mapping here looking at some of the different sources of long duration density power storage. And you can see on the scales from pound to the output, they're going up. So these are all technologies that are going. Some of them, as we look in here, we have the 2030 target of around 2,000 watt hours per kilogram. And you see some like zinc air in there. You see some high temperature superconducting systems that can be used as power sources. You see some magnesium dioxide and others in there as well. So this is looking at the traditional type of battery storage. Some of the other things you begin to look at is you see like the Li rechargeables. Their problem is they're limited to around 400 watt hours per kilogram. Then you see other electrochemical batteries, and Li air, Li chlorine, Li mercury are some of those that are going that way. There's also another type of high energy density storage called ultracapacitors. And ultracapacitors are very interesting. Some of the sources we use today where you require a lot of power, like in the military, you've heard the rail guns and the lasers used as weapons. You see it used in manufacturing where you're using lasers and other things for drilling. What they do is they actually store the energy in these ultracapacitors, and then they use that as an energy source. And what's good about an ultracapacitor is it can be drained very rapidly. So it's not a long-term storage of gradual power, but it's one there. Fuel cells are another place where you can store energy in them. And you begin to see fuel cells with real different watt hour kilogram ratings with the different materials used in them. Radioisotope storage. Most of the spacecraft that you see in deep space, the way they get their power is from radioactive isotopes. And they are doing it, and they have the potential for 4,000 to 5,000 watt hours a kilogram. That is not a active nuclear reactor. That is not a fusion reactor, but that is one where you use the heat from the isotopes to store power and generate power with that. So it's another one of the options. The other one, which is down at the bottom, is a very interesting one right now, energy harvesting. There's actually an article that I just saw this morning that was released today that talks about generating energy storage in high humidity environments by taking the air, compressing it, and in an ultra compressed area, it can actually store electricity in that air container. So again, there's a lot of work being done in looking at the different areas here, but these are just a few of the ones that really is making a lot of progress going forward. And again, there's so many others, but one of the other problems you have with this type of energy storage is that the management systems for managing it and working with it still have a way to go, in that they are to manage this in a grid operation as opposed to just a homeowner on the side of their house, but to manage as a grid, particularly in microgrids is where you see most of this deployed right now. You have to have a management system that looks at all the different sources of power you're generating, from the wind power, the solar power, the thermal power, the cogeneration power, all of those, and manages that mix and manages duration. You want some of that power to be immediately released to the grid and used. You want some of that to go in a buffering type of storage. You want some of that to go in a longer duration storage. So those management systems still have quite a ways to go with it, but those are just some of the beginning challenges with it. The other challenge with it is, you've heard me mention before, the concept of precision power. So many of our electronics today, so many of our systems want power that is stable within a range. And you want that range to be pretty consistent as you go with it. And some power, particularly when you're bringing battery power generated by green resources into the grid, the voltage of that can vary quite a bit, as well as the frequency of it can vary. And you want particularly the frequency to be very consistent as you power your grid and power the devices. So those are some of the challenges, but you can see, Sharif, there's a lot of options out there. And Donald mentioned one of the groups working on some of the correlation. And the California one he mentioned actually put a definition together of long duration energy storage. And their definition was 50 megawatts or greater, able to discharge electrons at that level for 8 hours or more, and they have to be operational by 2026, is what the coalition there said. So you're seeing the targets being put out there, you're seeing the power density put out there, and it's also very, very important that this be done in a cost-effective manner. I can begin to stitch together a whole network of long duration power storage, but the cost to build it, run it, and operate it, and the environmental cost of that are quite high. And so you have to take all those into account as you particularly look at the higher density, the storage formats that could be used to serve a region, a state, a country. And those are all considerations you have to take there. So Sharif, I hope that answered your question.
Thank you, Professor. Mr. David Schumacher.
everybody's getting into the long-term, long-duration energy storage. Everyone. So what I mean by that is that you'll see it in there's plenty of articles if you do a Google search about what's going on in the United States about this, but it's not the only place that it's happening. You'll see it in the EU. And closer to you, Dr. Sharif, is what's going on in China. China's spending a great amount of time and energy, no pun intended, to develop this. Everyone realizes that this is necessary for the future. Matter of fact, China, let's see, I think I just looked at something. Well, there was an article that I was reading where they're looking at, here we go, sorry. That's what happens when you click the wrong button. Anyway, they're spending a lot of time and energy to develop this. But you'd asked also about alternatives. And an alternative that I find that's exciting is a next generation technology of beaming power from space. So while you see lots of investment in storage that we think of as battery or the mechanical or the thermal systems that have been talked about, like for example, New York, the state here in the United States, is putting close to $17 billion into just demonstration projects for these things in their particular part of the state. They're investing in 4 different types of storage, and they're going to see which one is the winner. Because as someone said, I think it was David Smith, there's been no clear winner as far as who can do this and do it reliably and efficiently and cost effectively. Lockheed Martin, a military contractor here in the United States, is building systems for the U.S. Army to be used in the field. Now, a little closer to my background, I have a lot of years with the Air Force in technology, and that technology needs to move into some very rugged and unforgiving spaces. In the past, it's all been done with petrochemicals, with long logistics requiring roads, trucks, travel back and forth from a safer area out into perhaps a forward operating location. Solar's been used in some of those areas, but there's some distinct drawbacks of trying to use ground-based solar in a forward operating location. So AFRL, that's the Air Force Research Lab, has a project called SPIDER. I forget what the acronym stands for, but it's a cool acronym. And their whole idea is to be able to have essentially a solar farm in space, and to be able to take that and tightly focus that to receivers for a forward operating location and be able to supply electricity. And we're talking about electricity for a lot more than turning on lights. We're talking about a lot of that precision equipment that David Smith has talked about. And that requires power conditioning and a lot of other technology. So these are all in the early stages, but they all work together. Whether it's long-term storage to knit together when the lags in duration from when windmills are not producing power or solar panels are not producing power, or other restraints on other green energies, to be able to augment with something like that from space would be a tremendous advancement. But all of these have some way to go before they're mature enough that we're going to see them. I continue to see 2030 as a mark out there for different types of technologies. And I haven't investigated it enough to know whether that's hopeful or whether that's realistic. But I'm hoping on the realistic side, because whether it's military, whether it's civil, whether it's in industry, power is what drives the economy, and power is what drives quality of life for people. So these are all extremely important issues and can limit what we can do for the future. Matter of fact, it's limiting us now. What we can do with power now is limiting our ability to make things better all across the board for humanity and for the planet that we live on, being able to do this in an environmentally friendly way and at a cost-effective way. And when we come back around on my next pass, perhaps I'll talk a little bit about public policy, because that's a big part of developing this, developing public attitudes about how we generate, store, and distribute this type of power. So it's new, and when things are new, it's under the microscope, and people's first reaction is, no, let's not do anything new. And we need a better answer than that. But we'll talk about that next on the next go around.
Thank you, Mr. Donald.
Well, I will say that there is quite a bit of excitement about it, and many companies are getting into it. And the technology is already being used, and more of it is coming online weekly. Basically, there's so much of it. So the basic problem with it now is that it's not cost effective. But I think everyone is seeing that the cost of it's just going down like Moore's law, basically. I mean, when you build something that's new, it's just a prototype. It's extremely expensive to build. But then once you start figuring out how to manufacture it and how to manufacture it inexpensively and things like that, the prices go down enormously. So back to, so we've been taught, you have to remember that what basically the cycle for most of this is that during the day and when it's windy, energy is being generated. So you have that energy, and what your job is to store that energy so that where the times wind isn't going and the sun isn't going, then that energy that you stored will be able to be used to keep the electrical grid going. And so the main thing that main way it's done now is various kinds of mechanical ways. So one mechanical way of doing it would be to use the energy to pump water up to a dam. And then as soon as the sun went down, then you start releasing that water, and it spins a turbine. And that turbine would generate electricity, and that's being done. That's gravity. It's using gravity. And other things that have been done is they use the energy to take air and pump a cavern full of compressed air. And then they release the compressed air, and it spins a turbine, and that turbine generates electricity. Those are mechanical ways. And we're familiar with electrochemical ways, which is batteries. But if you think about batteries, the first thing we think of is is cars, because they're so out front about what we're doing with electricity. And then you think about it for a minute. Oh yeah, I use batteries in my flashlights and various kinds of various things all around. And so you think of batteries as, even with your house, they're power walls. So you think of batteries as these things that are small and compressed, that the smaller they are, the better in a lot of ways. But there are kinds of batteries that they have that are just tanks of fluid, that the fluid goes through these meshes, and that causes it to make an electrochemical reaction. So what I'm saying is that the size of the battery doesn't really matter that much if the battery's purpose is to take the solar and then convert the solar back to convert the energy that you got from the solar or wind back into energy. In other words, you're just saving it. So what they can do is they can take these chemicals and they can pump one from one tank to another, and then as it releases through this mesh, then the electricity is generated, and then the next day they pump it back like that with the energy that they get. So those are actually batteries. They're electrochemical batteries. And another way that it's people are working with is the idea, we all know about hydrogen cars. And in hydrogen cars, we have to get tanks of hydrogen, put them in the hydrogen car. The hydrogen car drives around, and when it runs out of hydrogen, it goes to a hydrogen gas station and it fills it back up, right? But if you're thinking in terms of just storing this energy and using it, an alternative to that is to have a plant, and all day long that the energy from the sun converts water to hydrogen, and they store all this hydrogen right there on the spot, and then they use the hydrogen to burn and create heat and run a turbine, and that turbine generates electricity. So that's another way of using the sun, a different way of using the sun's energy. There are plants now also that use molten salt. So what they do is they store the heat from the sun, and then using the heat from the sun, and they boil water basically and run turbines and do it that way. So point I'm making is it's kind of across the board. We're inventing new kinds of batteries. There's batteries that have been invented now that don't require rare earth elements. There's and it's kind of a different way of thinking when you don't have to think of a battery as something that's got to be really compact and fits in your car, that a battery could be the size of a power station. Then you can start thinking differently about the whole thing. And I do want to, emphasize that the estimated size of this market by 2040 will be 1.5 to 3 trillion dollars. So it's all technologies that we have in our hand. It's rapidly being developed right now, and as David said, there's no clear winner, but it's one of the most exciting areas in technology right now.
Thank you. Mr. Raymond.
I think it's really interesting what Donald was saying with regards to the size of batteries. One long-term storage device that he did overlook was the human body. And I think it's interesting also what he was saying is like the cyclic nature of that they're currently using, like using one form of energy to propel matter or water to be able to use it at another stage, is perhaps something that we could look, or I'm sure people are already looking more deeply into it. We have our own physiological system, working with the nervous system, working with the skeletal system, and all these different systems that come together give us the body that we use, and we're able to run this long-term storage energy device for anything up to 70 to 100 years. So the technology is there. I think and certainly we've been able to utilize this energy to power economies since the beginning of the agricultural revolution. So economically speaking, I would say probably the human body is the most efficient that we have come across to date for a means of powering and generating economies around the world. So yeah, that's all I have to say about that. Cheers for that, Donald.
It's an interesting idea, biological storage. We could add that to it. I'm sure there's ways of doing it.
Well, I think a combination of all these different storage devices is what makes us so efficient and so amazing. We are a very complex organism, biological, chemical, light. We're using all of these things in different weights, if you like, to be able to produce a continual output. So yeah, maybe the robots do know something. The AIs can solve it for us.
Well, imagine that you could have some sort of algae or something like that, and you use the sun from the algae, and then it, it photosynthesizes, but then something breaks it down the same way our body does and releases the energy, something along those lines. I mean, it seems totally plausible.
I like the idea too, Donald, of this algae perhaps forming a sheath or an extra sheath for those of us that are a little bit melanin challenged, to be able to withstand the effects of radiation a little better. Certainly, I'm sort of suffering from bits and pieces of that as I'm getting older, and I like the idea of slipping on a nice, comfortable algae gel in the morning to be able to go out into the world a little more safely.
Sounds good to me.
Thank, thank you. Mr. David Schumacher, what's your concluding remarks and what the interesting policy making strategy for energy sectors you want to advise?
Well, first off, excuse me. Well, first off, I want to acknowledge my fellow transhumanists, Donald and Raymond, as we're talking about energy from the body. That's a really interesting idea, of course. I want to comment on that briefly, and then I'll get to what you asked about, Sharif. We do see some medical devices these days that actually are powered from the body, things that are inserted and so forth. And then there are some transhumanists that are interested in transplants, which are, once again, powered from the body. And if you were to extrapolate that, I like Raymond's idea. Imagine my smartwatch, if I can remember which wrist I have it on. Imagine not having to need to charge that. Imagine if that was something that could just be rechargeable. Or from a more transhumanist perspective, that watch is embedded into my system, and all that I see that on the surface is just a display and just some controls to be able to monitor it. So these all sound like fantastic future devices, which they are, but they're coming. So stay tuned, and I love the acceptance that we see as we move on. This is the typical pattern that we see with technology, is that a lot of the new technology that we talk about on your forum, Sharif, can be 10, 15, 20 or further years away, and it sounds like science fiction to many people. And as we get closer, we start accepting the underlying tenets of it, and by the time it arrives, it's not as big a jump. And that takes me into the idea of what you asked about policy, as we get back to long duration energy storage. We build these plants to be able to pump water, or a cool one that I've seen is a machine that essentially does like what the water does. You stack bricks, and you stack bricks when you have power, and then you lower the bricks and you take that potential energy and turn it back into kinetic energy at times when you need demand. But these all take a physical footprint someplace, which means things like zoning laws, which means like, yeah, I want the electrical power, but please don't put that storage plant in my backyard, put it in somebody else's backyard. These become the public policy issues. But it first starts with the acceptance of the overall need and demonstration that we're seeing now. And perhaps it'll take a cue from what's going on in the nuclear industry. Back decades ago, the nuclear industry was a huge power plant that then distributed power over a wide-ranging area. And today we're seeing those smaller and smaller and smaller and closer to where the energy is being used. And I think we'll start to see that in these long-term energy storage systems as well. And then there's public policy about beaming power from space. I mean, that sounds like a really great idea. I don't have to have solar cells. When I drive outside of Phoenix, especially if I drive towards Nevada across the desert, you'll see many solar farms. So they're out and they're away from town, but nobody wants those close to town. And the ones that are on rooftops, you're not going to see them in town. So that energy from space needs a place to land. So where's that going to be? Is it going to be 25, 30, 50 miles out into the desert? Or if you're not in a desert area and you have mountainous terrain, forests, things of that nature, where do you put those? How do you zone for that? And how do you shape public opinion so that people aren't worried about side effects of that power being beamed from space? The things that come back to my mind was all of the uproar some while back about 5G and how it was going to poison all of humanity. So, we can see some of these same types of fears boiling into these different plants, different landing pads for energy from space. This will be one of the things to take into account, whatever country you happen to find yourself in. And public policy getting out there, talking about it, and showing people what the positives and negatives are in a true fashion, and then being able to answer those realistically. That's what it's going to take. So perhaps we'll have a public policy discussion show sometime. I did this very generally, but there are many specifics to be taken into account as well. Thank you for another great show, Sharif.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Donald, what's your concluding remarks for today's session?
Well, I think it's fascinating what David said. In the United States, the petroleum industry and in the world has an immense amount of power. They're given hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies from the United States government, and they absolutely control states like Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and other states in the United States, and they are fighting this tooth and nail. And one of the ways they fight it is through propaganda and other kinds of things, which makes David's policy things very, very difficult because people they're bombarded with misinformation, and they have a hard time understanding what's actually going on. I mean, yeah, so that really gets to be a big problem when you're trying to do it. But what I really all I really want to say is, it's just kind of simple. We're trying to find a way to paint over the cracks in solar and wind, and we've got the solar and wind at some time of the day. So how do we store the solar and wind when we have it, and then be able to use it at the times we don't have it? And I mentioned a few of many, many, many ways that it can be done. And after I listed it, both Raymond and David came up with new ways of doing it. So that kind of means that if it's something that you get interested in, it's not that limited. It's it's one of those things that's got the option of somebody making breakthroughs that change everything. It's a really exciting field, and it's absolutely necessary. And there's I didn't mention there's various people giving gigantic rewards for $1 million rewards and things like that in contests to see who can come up with the best long-term storage solution. California has incredible incentives for you to start to work on it for research and development, and in Europe they're doing that too. So it's something that both the governments know about and something that anyone as an individual, it's still blue sky. You can get into it and possibly make a real difference. Thank you.
Mr. Ramon, what's your concluding remarks for today?
I think with regards to the petroleum companies, I mean, they've had a pretty good run. We've enabled them for a very, very long time. I think it's definitely, they're aware that we're beginning to disable them. I think lending that particular area too much attention, even with regards to, even though they are very, very active with regards to policy making and policy breaking and all these areas, focus on the solution, focus on the problem. They're not the problem. The problem is something completely different. And I think if we focus on what it is that we want, the solutions will inevitably present themselves. Yeah, it's a very, very interesting time that we live in. I say this again and again. Every time I'm invited to come on to the show with Sharif and other panelists. Very exciting time to be alive. There's so many different areas of massive progression in so many different areas. I think one of the most interesting ones that that we have to look forward to is governance, finding different ways to govern ourselves, govern countries, govern these different bodies, corporations, and so forth, so that they are less inclined towards searching up profit and all of that, but more towards the greater good of humanity, if you like. So thanks once again, Sharif, for inviting me along. Very, very honored to be here amongst such wonderful company. And I'd wish everybody a wonderful week. All right, take care.
Thank you. Thank you. This is excellent discussion, especially for the developing nations audience. It will be really helpful. Yes, and a country like Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, every country has a lot of energy related problem, and we need to solve together. We need a lot of innovations. We need alternative solutions. We need to work together. We need to develop better worlds, and that is the objective World Talent Economy Forum working, and we need more of your support. We are taking a lot of real world projects. We want to invite you all, especially those who regularly join World Talent Economy Forum. We propose their name in different high quality conference, different policy research, and different projects. We are proposing all of your name. So hopefully, as a team, we can uplift country like Bangladesh, country like India, country like Sri Lanka, and many other developing nations. So your contributions always welcome, and we need more brainstorming and more real project. Thank you, Professor David Schumacher, Professor Donald, Mr. Raymond, for joining today's session. Thank you. Bye bye, and take care.